SAARC as an institution has never inspired South Asian communities. It has been a totally government-centric, state-centric institutions.
How does India engage a region which has infrastructure needs, which has all kinds of developmental needs, but India doesn't have the money?
Reason why the Belt Road Initiative or the various countries have actually better economic ties with China than India is actually, I think, a reflection on India's inability to step into that position. Now, India has started to do that more belatedly, but in a way, it's really sort of trying to catch up with China.
The only goal of US in South Asia is to check China, nothing else. It doesn't have anything good about India. It doesn't have anything major to say about other South Asian countries. It is only interested in how to stop China right at its doorstep.
India really needs to create an alternative to the Belt Road Initiative. And to start with in the subcontinent. That's going to be a very, very important alternative.
India has literally given up its very traditional, very well-established and very well-founded position in South Asia. We used to be everywhere.
South Asia or Southern Asia is home to about 2 billion people and encompasses India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and the Maldives. This region is united by a shared tapestry of philosophical, ethnic, religious, cultural, and post-colonial experiences. Despite these commonalities, South Asia remains one of the least interconnected regions globally. Now, India finds itself in this complex and often volatile neighborhood, one that occasionally aligns with, but more frequently challenges its strategic interests. Under its Neighbourhood First policy, the Modi government has sought to engage both its immediate and extended neighbours more proactively. This comes against the backdrop of China's growing assertiveness, its coercive economic strategies, and its rising ambitions in the Indian Ocean region. All of this unfolds within a global landscape characterized by protracted conflicts and attritional warfare. So, what drives the political instability among India's neighbors? What innovative strategies can India adopt to foster deeper regional engagement and mitigate the risks of being encircled by an intermittently hostile neighborhood? These questions gain urgency as the world braces for Donald Trump and his America First politics, a declining Russia because of the Russia-Ukraine war, an inwardly preoccupied Europe, and an increasingly aggressive China. Moreover, how should India address challenges posed by persistent anti-India factions such as the Communist Party in Nepal or Khaleda Zia's BNP in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka's Marxist JVP that is currently in power? To explore these pressing questions, I am today joined by two distinguished scholars. First is Dr. WPS Sidhu, a professor at the New York University Center for International Cooperation. Dr. Sidhu has previously worked with the East-West Center and the Geneva Center for Security Policy. An authority on Southern Asia, regionalism, and security challenges, his extensive body of work includes the Iraq Crisis and World Order, Kashmir, New Voices, New Approaches, and a fantastic book on India and China, which is called Cooperation or Conflict. We are very honored to have you with us. Then I'm also joined by Professor Mahendra Lama, a renowned developmental economist and professor at the School of International Studies, JNU. He has served as a member of India's National Security Advisory Board and as the Vice-Chancellor of the Central University of Sikkim. Additionally, he has held the position of Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of Sikkim. Professor Lama's research focuses on regional economic cooperation in South Asia, human security in India, and India-China relations. His widely acclaimed work continues to shape policy discourse on developmental and economic issues in the region. Honored to have you as well. So very happy to have both of you on the show. And my first question is to you, Dr. Sidhu, which is that, SAARC could never take off. SAARC as a regional organization could never take off. And right now, the way things are, it doesn't look, the promises for SAARC taking off look very bleak. So, do you think that something like a nimble minilateral or a more bilateral approach to tackling India's neighborhood seems
Mhm.
like a better idea in terms of an analytical framework? Because what we are
Mhm.
also searching for is an analytical framework.
Mhm.
And what are your thoughts on that?
So, if you look at the analytical framework, it would have to be one of regional organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And the way regional organizations, successful regional organizations which have come into existence, have come together for two reasons or two
Yeah,
factors. One is the hegemon's commitment to that organization.
right.
And second is a real desire to engage with former adversaries. The best example of this is the European Union,
Mm-hmm.
where you saw the origins of this by the coming together of France and Germany
Right.
at the end of the Second World War
Hmm.
to create what has now become the European Union. So, in that sense, that framework is important to sort of keep in mind when you look at South Asia. In South Asia, the hegemon is obviously India, and in many ways, the main challenger is Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these countries were very reluctant to get into a regional arrangement, even though it may have benefited India and Pakistan both in different ways in times. But that simply did not happen because, in some ways, the rapprochement has not happened.
Right.
That defining war has not happened.
Mm-hmm.
One would have thought Bangladesh or the creation of Bangladesh may
Bangladesh,
have been
yes.
one element of that, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
And so, not surprisingly, it was Bangladesh
Yeah.
which led to the initiation of SAARC
Yeah.
and in 1984. And it was obviously not the hegemon,
Mm-hmm.
but it is to the credit of Bangladesh that it was able to bring the hegemon along very reluctantly
Mm-hmm.
to be a member of SAARC.
Mm-hmm.
And the same was also true of Pakistan for very different reasons. And which is why, among other reasons, between these two, particularly between India and Pakistan,
Mm-hmm.
there has been a reluctance to commit to SAARC. Sometimes it's been India, sometimes it's been Pakistan. So, as you rightly pointed out, certainly under the Modi government, there has been a approach. The Indian approach has been SAARC minus one, which has been Pakistan.
Yes.
But in addition to that, as you rightly pointed out, there is also now a desire to look at what you call multilateralisms. So BIMSTEC, for example,
Right.
is a very, very good example of that, or the effort to open up to Afghanistan from Iran is
Yes.
another approach to
Yeah.
that as well. And the South, of course, is more connected with India anyway.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right in saying that in the absence of SAARC, you're likely to see these sub-regional organizations
Right.
coming together.
Well, that's a very important point you raised, and with that, I'd like to go to Professor Lama out there, who's very well known for his developmental economics and these kind of themes. Often we hear Professor Lama in the context of South Asia. The fact that India has to take a more innovative regional approach. Okay, India doesn't come with deep pockets, but China does. India's neighbors, it's strange that India's neighbors have taken a position of strategic autonomy when they tackle India, but they have no such insistence when it comes to China. And the material benefits offered by China are very well welcomed by these neighbors. So, in that context, when there is this discourse on how can we work upon these innovative regional frameworks or regional engagements, I mean, how do you view such things, and what would be your 2 cents on how can we really put this together?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you know, regionalism in a very unique geography like South Asia would be a very, very difficult propositions. We have been watching this for last 30, 40 years now. This is because the India is so central to and so critical to the entire regionalism process. 70% of population, 75% of GDP, 78% of exports are all India centric. One. Secondly, I don't think India is very keen to participate in the regionalism process because India has always been a major uh, player as far as bilateralism is concerned. We blame Pakistan for not really going with the process of SAARC. But look at the other regionalism processes in South Asia, the IORC, the BIMSTEC, BBIN, BCIM, where there is no Pakistan, right? So there is something fundamentally wrong. One is the second very critical issue is SAARC as an institution has never inspired South Asian communities. It has been a totally government centric, state centric institutions. And the third, very important, is the model which we adopted in order to promote SARC process was lock, stock, and barrel, brought from the countries from other countries where which have nothing to do with the South Asian communities. Say, for example, we started talking about. I was a member of the independent expert group representing India in the SARC process. You suddenly realize that you bring a model like what Europe did. You first talk about the preferential trading area regime, free trade, then you have a customs union, common market, and all. That model would never fit into, right? The fourth thing, which is very critical in South Asia, is you don't have a regional leadership. No leader is accepted as a regional leader, unlike Europe, right? Mitterrand, right? Unlike Southeast Asian countries, Lee Kuan, right? So you don't have a regional leadership, right? Where that's why I think there are Pakistan, of course, is a very critical factor in as a stumbling block, but I would say that there are several other inbuilt factors that would never allow SARC to proceed further. Pakistan has been a major stumbling block in the development integration of SARC process. But I think the very nature of SARC as an institutions would not allow SARC to really go forward. And I don't see any hopes unless something really big happens.
And actually, just to sort of shift this a little bit away from SARC and talk more about South Asia or Southern Asia, I think it's always been a theater where great powers have been present. And talking specifically about one great power, which is the United States,
Mhm.
I mean, how has the United States withdrawal from South Asia kind of impacted India's strategic calculus? Because as far as I see it, I see that even though when United States was present in the region by way of supporting Pakistan or by way
Mhm.
of its engagement in Iraq, pretty never ending, which finally ended in 2020. So that presence wasn't particularly advantageous to India, but its exit has been really disadvantageous because the power vacuum was usurped by China, and that in many ways right now then creates this problem, or this how do I say, this contradiction in how China and India
Mhm.
view Asia and the world. Because while India stands for a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world, China stands for a unipolar Asia, even though a multipolar world.
Mhm.
So I think, how do you then look at that in a more strategic sense? And I'll come to Professor Lama with the same question later.
So it's debatable whether the US is withdrawn from the region
Hmm.
because in
Continentally perhaps, because
yes,
yeah.
uh, but also I think if you look at the US involvement in the region, it was invariably related to security, its own security, and even if its relationship with Pakistan was very close at one point, it was really about American security, and sort of first kicking the Russians out of Afghanistan, and then subsequently, chasing the Al Qaeda and Taliban grouping out of there as well. So in that sense, it was the U.S. presence and may have prevented great conflict to some extent, but it did not entirely stop it. It did not stop it in 65. It did not stop it in 71. It reduced the duration of that. So ironically, it is actually at the end of the Cold War where in a way you had the freeing up of that actually led to a greater cooperation between the countries in the region as well. China's presence in the subcontinent, or Southern Asia, as you rightly called it, is actually economic. They have only provided, if you like, with Pakistan, security dimensions, but that's only with Pakistan. With all of the other countries, it is really through the economic presence. And that is not so much a strength of China, but the weakness and inability of India
Yeah.
to step up and provide what the neighbors need. The reason why the Belt Road Initiative or the various countries have actually better economic ties with China than
Yeah.
India
Yeah.
is actually, I think, a reflection on India's inability to step into that position. Now, India has started to do that more belatedly, but in a way, it's really sort of trying to catch up with China.
Okay. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that India is trying to now catch up with China, and that brings me back to the same question on how does India engage a region which has infrastructure needs, which has all kinds of developmental needs, but
Mhm.
India doesn't have the money. So, does India do it by itself, bilaterally, by way of the line of credits,
Mhm.
etc.,
Mhm.
or does it use this framework called a triangular cooperation
Mhm.
that you get like a richer, third partner into this equation? And I think India has been doing it, and Professor Lama perhaps can shed more light on that. When you think of the northeast of India and the kind of connectivity projects that perhaps India is now trying with Japan now, or
Mhm.
something similar. So, do you think that this kind of a framework, even though it is not a quote unquote exact bilateral approach, but perhaps could be better in the interim, because India's, of course, India doesn't have the same kind of economic prowess as China has? What do you think, Professor Lama?
Well, you know, while agreeing with Professor Sidhu, I would feel that the very approach of China and India vis-a-vis South Asia is strikingly different. You get it? Uh, in the last 20 years or 2 decades, you can see China engaging South Asia in three different ways. I personally call it a Trisul approach, right? It has engaged South Asia at a very, very local level. You can see the Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan. You can see Nathula in India, right? Or Lipulek in India. You can see various, at least 5 or 10 now entry points into Nepal. Then you can see Karakoram the in Pakistan. So it's a very very local integration that has got direct linkages with all the mainstream, what you call it, physical infrastructures. The second is of course nation to nation, the bilateral engagements. So, Beijing, Delhi, Beijing, Islamabad. The third is China's engagement, all these countries at a fairly, what you call it, regional level. You see, Whereas, what has really happened is uh, India has literally given up its very traditional, very well established, and very well founded position in South Asia. We used to be everywhere. Today, also, if you go to Nepal, I was in Bangladesh just few days back. I was talking to people around. The hope they have on India, the and as compared to other players including China and US, the assertions they make as far as India's participation in these countries are, it's you can't imagine, despite some kind of bilateral problems. Therefore, what has India done in the past is, where why we have started losing losing our hold in the neighboring countries, is because we have never rebuilt our constituencies which we built during 60s, 70s and 80s in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. The constituencies are all gone. The secondly, our institutional linkages today with these countries are very very, what you call it, feeble and very very fragile. And the third, of course, is India does not realize that all these countries have now a new generations of politicians, bureaucrats, businessmen, civil society members. So India goes with this same traditional thinking that we will manage, we will do this, but the things have changed. Whereas I see Chinese have started working on 10 different lines to engage these countries.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting part about India's, India's preference for stated coism. I think somewhere comes in the way of understanding how to adapt and evolve. And I think one of the best examples, or it's not the best, it's a bad example, but one of the best examples that comes to my mind is the example of Bangladesh, because we kept engaging the Hasina government, not realizing that perhaps not just the army, but the people, the opposition, everybody was turning against her. And when Bangladesh fell, and she fell, yeah, yeah, and when she fell, I mean, India's
Mhm.
role in 1971 and everything, I mean, if you look now, the way the different agencies in Bangladesh have been trying to subvert India's role in their independence is something which is very worrisome. And that brings me to this question about Bangladesh, which is that, and I want to come to you, Dr. Sidhu, with this, that you mentioned that right now China's role in India's neighborhood has largely been economic. When it comes to security, it's basically Pakistan. But if you look at the data, now China is also the topmost supplier of weapons to Bangladesh. And if you go by what the Indian intelligence agencies had to say when Hasina fell from grace, was that it seems to be a Pakistan-China nexus working out there, even though a lot of people would like to believe that as a CIA a motivated operation. But what are your thoughts on that? And how do we now go ahead with a new government? There is no new government, as there's an interim government with Yunus, and
Mhm.
I'm not sure how tolerant of Yunus would Donald Trump be. But nonetheless, what your thoughts on Bangladesh and what should have India done right?
I think you very rightly pointed out in saying that, and again, I agree also with what Professor Lama has been saying,
Yeah.
is that the Indian commitment and investment, and actually it has been very substantial, whether you look at Afghanistan
Mm-hmm.
or even in Bangladesh, it's been in the billions of dollars. Which is the biggest, not just line of credit,
Yeah.
but development assistance
Mm-hmm.
that India has given. But unfortunately, it tends to be tied
Yeah.
to one particular regime. You
Yeah.
saw
This is
this
the
in the
Ghani
case,
government in
exactly,
Afghanistan.
and
Yeah.
you saw that in the case of Afghanistan as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
where it doesn't quite trickle down to the community, even though there are community projects. The community buy-in is not necessarily there, and so
Mm-hmm.
when the regime goes, now India has really no locus standi in Afghanistan at
Yeah.
all, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
But coming to your question on Bangladesh, and yes, there are conspiracy and there are counter conspiracy theories as well. But I'd actually go a step back.
Yeah.
Um of course, every country has some legitimate defense requirements,
Hmm.
and it is in the interest of Bangladesh to look at its own defense requirements as well. I know in the past that Bangladesh actually reached out to India for some of its weapon requirements.
Mm-hmm.
India, in its wisdom, felt it was not right for it to supply it because maybe the logic was, well, who is Bangladesh going to use these weapons against?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that may be one way, and I think that was a missed opportunity because then it's this vacuum, it's this gap. If India is not going to do that, then Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or the others are going to go to other countries,
Yeah.
and in this case, the country happens to be China, which can, in any case, has a wider spectrum of weapons that it can supply or is willing to supply than India.
So in many ways, then it brings us back to the same thing, which is that India has not been able to fill the gap or fill the vacuum which was left by, say, for example, a declining Russian presence in our continental
Mhm.
domain or the withdrawal of the United States. And but I still would go back to Professor Lama and then ask him. How does he see the deepening of alliance between, and since because this is we are living in the era of the Ukraine war, and of course this has implications for what is how is Russia's alliance with China is deepening. We do see that the two countries have done a lot, quite a few exercises, joint exercises in the Indian Ocean region, especially in the Indo-Pacific region as well. But how do you see the deepening of alliance between Russia and China impacting India's choices or India's options? Because, of course, Russia continues to be a partner. India has taken a very steady stand of, I would say, a neutrality in the war. But when it comes to India's own backyard, and when you see India's best friend sort of, towing the line of India's arch rival, how does that play out? And what then is the role of the neighborhood there? It's a fairly layered question, I understand, but then I would like you to unravel it. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I think for India, a very, very critical instrument would be to really keep South Asia intact, right? Away from the forces that have started emerging. Look at go little beyond South Asia, and let's touch Myanmar, right? Look at after 1935 Government of India Act and after particularly independence, how we have lost Myanmar. It used to be our playfield, education to health to infrastructure to army, what not we influenced. Today we are sidelined in Myanmar. And on top of that, instead of doing a multiple linkages, multiple connectivity projects with Myanmar, given what Chinese is doing there in terms of China Myanmar economic corridor, or literally capturing of the ports like Chakfu there for their gas and oil projects. What we are saying is we will close down the borders, right? Which goes against India's activist policy, India's neighborhood first policy, right? And in fact, India's robust federalism, because 98% of the borders of the Northeast region is with the neighboring countries. Only 2% is with the mother country, India. Right? In such a situation, I think if you close down the borders, what would happen? So I think India has to be absolutely clear about what its national interests are, regardless of its alliance with US or alliance with Russia and all. Because 30 years back, 30, 40 years back, when we were students, our textbook used to be full of how US is a major anti-India force in the Indian Ocean, right? Just 40 years back. You just look through when I used to, Professor Sidhu and all, we all studied in the School of International Studies, possibly, right? But all our textbooks used to be how Indian Ocean has been made a kind of a very problematic space by US. Today is the same US which comes to us and tells us that you have to align us. The only goal of US in South Asia is to check China, nothing else. It doesn't have anything good about India. It doesn't have anything major to say about other South Asian countries. It is only interested in how to stop China right at its doorstep. So why does it go to Nepal saying that you should join the Indo-Pacific? What has got Nepal to do with the Indo-Pacific, right? For that matter, what has got Bhutan to do with Indo-Pacific, right? So I would strongly feel that India has to be absolutely clear about its stand.
Yeah, I would like to. I was just intrigued that when you were mentioning about the different linkages, and you said that India is absent there while China is present in so many ways. I was just intrigued why you didn't mention the India, Myanmar, Thailand, that highway. I mean, do you see that this is
Absolutely.
something?
You see, it's a critical element. Prime Minister Modi is the first Prime Minister of India who has visited Northeast region over, I think, almost 70 times in the last 10 years, right? He sends his minister every every month, every fortnight. A minister goes, and there's a massive progress in Northeast as far as development of infrastructures, its linkages with the neighboring countries. But somewhere there is a disconnect. On the one hand, Prime Minister says we'll have to really push this game to integrate India through Northeast with the Southeast Asian countries. and we talk about Sitwe Port, we talk about India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway. But when it comes to really thinking big about it, we lose the game, right? Say for example, in the same border between China and Myanmar, Museruili border, the border trade goes up to almost $4 to $5 billion. In the same border between Thailand and Myanmar, Mesot and Miyawadi, the border trade goes up to almost $4 billion. And what is our trade? Total trade of India with Myanmar, with such a traditionally linked, connected country, is not even $2 billion, right? So I think there is some kind of a mismatch, disconnect among our policymakers, among our constituencies, within these countries. And I think, Ch- unlike us, China is well ahead as far as use of his machineries are concerned, right? I find very striking difference.
So the question that I had earlier asked to Professor Lama about
Right.
how does that impact India's strategic calculus, if at all? What
Right.
are your thoughts on that?
Excellent question. And I think the way that I would, contextualize this again is to look at the past. When there are times when Russia's actions have created strategic challenges for India. The previous time this happened was in Afghanistan.
Yes, that's right.
And the Indian response was a kind of a very uncomfortable neutrality on the public stage, but privately sort of, chastising the Soviets at that point in time for what they had done.
Yeah.
You see a similar sort of scenario here as well. But what also happened during that time was it gave India the opportunity to look at other alternatives for weapons in particular. So in the 80s, if you look at India's procurement, it goes to Europe in a very
Yes.
big way.
Yeah.
It's buying aircraft carriers from the United Kingdom, aircraft from France,
Yeah.
submarines from Germany, guns from Sweden,
Yes.
torpedoes from Italy. I mean, it was literally buying up all of Europe, and that gave a signal to the Russians that there were alternatives. Of course, India went broke in in that process, and that led to the economic reforms. So there was some good that came out of that process as well. Now, in that context, again, I think the Ukraine conflict in the short term, at the tactical level, may benefit India because it's getting cheap oil from Russia.
Yes.
But in the long term, it is problematic for India.
Yes.
And I think but it also provides opportunities for India to move more towards the multipolar world, to establish that much more significantly. And it's a tricky game because on the one hand, it does not want to be a victim to the weaponization of the dollar, but it also does not want to necessarily be only beholden to Russia. It wants options.
Yeah.
And that's the big sort of challenge for India as it kind of exploring this process as well. On your point about Russia-China joint exercises, I don't think that necessarily impacts India directly, because in my mind, that is very much related to the United States. And I think there has been a clear firewall between India and the United States on the Russia-China partnership of it, because the Quad is not really designed to be a military force in that sense.
Yes.
That is why, in fact, you're seeing the AUKUS process come through a little bit as well. So I think,
And there's another Quad with Philippines.
absolutely,
Yes.
precisely, and so I think I think India is reasonably comfortable, and to be honest, I think the Americans are equally comfortable, and they understand as well that India is not going to come to their fight with China and Russia, just as India knows that the US is not going to come to its fight with China. So I think there is a fair amount of understanding there as well. Now, the Russia-China joint exercises may be a problem if it's challenging the freedom of navigation.
Right.
And that would pose more of a fundamental problem for India, where India is certainly more on the side of, open,
Yes.
free,
Yeah.
and fair, kind of navigation through particularly the South China Sea. So that's one sort of issue
Yeah.
as well.
Thankfully, we are not there yet.
We're definitely not there yet as well. Yeah.
So, Dr. Sidhu, we all agree that this is a fairly complex situation.
Mhm.
There will always be governments in our neighbors that are pro-India or anti-India, and there are certain factions which will continue to be anti-India in their rhetoric. Like, for example, the communists in Nepal or the BNP,
Mhm.
which is likely to come back once the elections are finally held in Bangladesh.
Mhm.
Or, for example, the current party in Sri Lanka.
Mhm.
So I mean, one cannot be held ransom to who is the next government. But in terms of a grand strategy, what do you think what is the way out in terms of what could be the right solutions, in your opinion, that India and Indian government should exercise?
Uh, it's a very interesting question, but also a very difficult one. Uh, maybe two separate approaches.
Okay.
One of them actually, I think, dates back, if you like, to the Monroe Doctrine
Okay.
as to what the US did vis-a-vis largely Latin America, but that was very much related to Europe. And in some ways, India has been trying to do that. And again, Professor Lama is absolutely right in saying there was a time we all grew up discussing how Indian Ocean had become an American lake. And that notion and that understanding has changed because
Changed.
rightly the US is now pulled out. It is India's playfield in many ways, with what it wants to do with that. And so I think one of the elements very much is to step up into that game, not just in terms of security. So if Bangladesh is looking for weapons, to then sort of see, how you might have some kind of an understanding or, where you supply the weapons to or ensure their security vis-a-vis yourself in many ways as well. The second element has to be, and you pointed this out already, is the economic dimension of it. And there, the trilateral cooperation is certainly one way to think about it. You mentioned Japan. Certainly, South Korea is another major actor. Is that
Right.
India really needs to create an alternative to the Belt Road Initiative. And to start with, in the subcontinent, that's going to be a very, very important alternative. One way to do that, and this comes to the second point, is to revive SAARC in a very serious way, and to try and sort of address. But of course, much of this has to relate to its relationship with Pakistan, which at the moment India doesn't even want to discuss. And so, if can you actually at least do SAARC -1, and then see as and when Pakistan is ready to kind of integrate with that, I think is maybe one way to go about it as well. But to your question again, this has to be more than specifically related to any one sort of regime.
Yes.
And I think that's an important element to do that. Now, and again, in some ways, if you look, for example, at the parallel in Europe or even in the United States, the US has had to deal with governments in Mexico, in particular, which were not of the same ilk, of what Washington wanted. And this is again going to be the case when Trump comes to power. But at the same time, the economic ties are so close that it would be suicidal for them to want to sort of, try and change or not live with the politics which the country has democratically elected. And that, I think, is an important element, that India needs to keep in mind as well. One thing, and I don't think been explored, is if you look at UN peacekeeping, 60% of UN peacekeepers come from literally 4 countries in South Asia: Pakistan, Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. Now, these troops are actually working together in UN peacekeeping missions. People have told me with great pride there have been UN operations where Indian troops are on the ground being supported by Pakistani helicopters. And it's always puzzled me as to why, in the South Asian context, these countries cannot actually train together for peacekeeping. And that may actually be one way to lead to a certain degree of comfort and cooperation.
Certain degree of trust building, of
Exactly,
course,
within the
yes. Yeah.
militaries,
Okay.
to do that. And of course, you have your bilateral challenges and conflicts, but this may actually be one way to say how we can contribute to the global good
Right.
in one sort of other area.
Professor Lama, as to what do you think are the best solutions? I mean, throughout your interventions, you've been giving me so many solutions, but just to sort of collate that for clarity, yes.
You see, thank you very much. See, India, all said and done, has created a very high level of interdependence among the South Asian countries. India's relations, Nepal cannot survive without India. India cannot survive with Nepal. Similarly, with Bangladesh, with Bhutan, with Sri Lanka, interdependence is so conspicuously present in the relationship, right? And look at today, Bangladesh. Bangladesh and India are so interdependent. Some of us who have done some policy studies, work with the governments, both sides of the fence, we realize that they are so interdependent. Connectivity, tourism, health, education, the energy, the river management system. They just can't think that India can be dislocated from this relationship, or India cannot think that Bangladesh could be dislocated. It is so. Now, the more critical factor is now Bangladesh, the interdependence has started taking a shape of sub regionalism. Nepal, Bhutan coming together and using Indian corridor to export electricity to Bangladesh, right? Nepal, Bhutan coming together and cutting through Fulbari corridor or certain northeastern, what you call the integrated checkposts, and going to the seaports of Bangladesh, and organizations like ADB, Japan's JICA coming in a big way to support this kind of projects. So I think at this juncture, despite political differences, and I tell you very frankly, it is not anti India sentiments in Bangladesh or Nepal or somewhere else. It is anti Indian government sentiments. There's a huge difference, right? No Bangladeshi would say that we are against Indians, but they would definitely say that we don't like the policy of government of India, right? So we have to make a very very clear difference about what they say actually. Don't go by what media does in terms of its regular hyping, but the most critical thing at at this juncture is to keep the engagements with Bangladesh intact, layers and layers of intacts. You have water, you have electricity, you have all kinds of intacts, right? Keep this as as strong as possible, because situation will change in the course of next 1.5 years. And if you don't do this, what would happen is the Chinese, the Americans, all the anti-Indian forces will come together and try to sideline India. That's what has happened in many countries in South Asia, including Pakistan, and it's likely to happen in Nepal also. So India has to be extremely careful about about not engaging or about withdrawing from the process of engagement at this juncture. It should be, in fact, it should be much more elaborate process of engagement with all the neighboring countries, despite the political changes. Look at Maldives today. Look at Sri Lanka, right?
Yeah. No, I'm, yeah. So basically, we all sort of agree to the point that India has to sort of engage with the country and not the regime,
Mhm.
and perhaps also create more people to people ties, and keep those institutional frameworks working and activated and all of that. And I think that's a very valid point, because this is perhaps a kind of a mistake that we can spot in hindsight, which is that we've been focusing more on regimes and less on the country as a whole. With that, let me also ask the two of you, and I'll ask Dr. Sidhu that question first, is that the purpose of the print worldview is to actually create this pool of references that students, researchers, and those that are interested, including the lay audiences, that are interested in researching about this topic any further, if they want to read up. So what, in your opinion, are the best books, apart from the ones that you've already written? But any books, any documentaries, any special X handles to follow? I mean, whatever you would like to recommend.
Well, I was thinking more globally
Uh-huh.
in many ways as well. And there's a new book coming out, it hasn't come out yet, by Hal Brands,
Okay.
called The Eurasian Century, which really talks about the role of Eurasia in many ways of, through the hot wars and the cold wars.
Right.
And that may be something to focus on in the context of the decolonization process, even though that does not necessarily look at that very much as well. And these I understand are of course much broader books, rather than sort of focusing more specifically onto the subcontinent. The other one perhaps I would talk about, which again would put an interesting framework,
Right.
is Farid Zakaria's The Age of Revolutions,
Mm-hmm.
and essentially kind of looking at how there have been backlashes to all of them ever since the 1600s,
Right.
and how that has in many ways kind of influenced some of the developments which are going on here as well. The third one, I think we've probably all given up on X or Twitter, but one sort of podcast that I might mention in passing is somebody who coined the phrase polycrisis.
Mm-hmm.
Is an economist by the name of Adam Tooze, who has a wonderful podcast titled Ones and Twos.
Okay.
And his name is spelled Tooze,
Mm-hmm.
where he really talks about how there are these polycrises kind of emerging, and how do you kind of deal with that? And this has been one of the big challenges. We're not now dealing with just single issues.
Right.
And so, for example, if you look at South Asia, as it were, it's not just the military or the economic dimension now. Climate is a very important element.
True.
Migration is going to become very important. COVID was very crucial.
Yeah.
So all of these elements, how do you kind of explain the polycrisis? I think Adam Tooze's podcast and his writings are very, very sound in that. Again, very global. He doesn't look necessarily as much at South Asia as he probably should,
Right.
but it's one that I would recommend.
Okay, then that's great. And Professor Lama, what about your recommendations on similar things?
Well,
Yes.
very, very interesting. Yeah, because uh, our students, particularly in JNU, are very fond of reading both at a very, very practical level inputs and what the global writers say about it. But in the classroom, we also tell them that you really have to read something which is written at the regional level,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we encourage them to read books by written by our own diplomats, own academics, and within the region, of course, in South Asia, and of course in other neighboring countries. And one of the recent books which I have read very keenly is something by Ambassador Tariq Karim. Tariq Karim is a very well known scholar and, of course, a good, well known diplomat from Bangladesh. He has written a book on the tortuous evolution of SAARC, Bangladesh's travels of sub regional cooperation. It's a fascinatingly beautiful book because he tells us what are the real uh, what are the real critical determinants for Pakistan, for Bangladesh to participate in the regionalism process, and in what way it can contribute. This is a very interesting book. The second book, which I, of course, I have read very carefully, is a very interesting book by our own very well-known journalist Shastri Ramachandran on Beyond Binaries: The World of India and China. Absolutely a ground level analysis of what really happens between India and China. See, it's a very interesting volume by Shastri because Shastri was also based in China as a journalist. So he gives a very ground level assessment of what China and India are all about. What are the connections? What are the disconnections? Very interesting and a very good, simple reading. The third book I would like to recommend is, of course, our own book, which we did with the University of Michigan, on why we should move from a debate between why we should move from a very orthodox security centric debate about border as a geometric line, from this orthodox thinking to why not we move to a debate on borderland. Because the moment you move from geometric line to the borderland, then you have communities, tourism, pilgrimages, natural resources, all kinds of things, and that really enlivens the debate, right? And that brings in so much of warmth for a country like India in its interactions with the neighboring countries. And the fourth book, which I have really keenly read, is, of course, there's a very interesting book called India and the Future of G20 by published by the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, right? Edited by its director Iqbal Singh Sevia. It's a very interesting book. It brings in what India did in the past 50 years as far as Global South is concerned. What was its contributions in UNCTAD, G77, non-aligned movement, right? So it's very interesting. But I would like to also say that I think the readers are more keen on, to a large extent, the students are more keen on policy studies now, right? What kind of, because academic, knowledge generation has to be combined with a very strong, realistic, policy based studies. And that's what we have been trying to do. Just a few years back, the Economic Research Institute of ASEAN, the Japan Economic Institute of Energy, and we in JNU came together and we produced a very interesting volume as to how northeast of India could play a powerful center linking South Asia, Eastern South Asia, and Southeast Asian countries, right? Bringing power from all countries and sending them to Southeast Asian countries.
All right. Yes. Yeah. No, thank you so much, Professor Lama. Now you're free to say whatever you want.
Thank you for having me on this program. It's a delight and a pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, thank you so much. It was equally, a pleasure for us to have you here in studio. Thank you so much. That was undoubtedly an insightful discussion on the state of South Asia and the strategic options available to India. Now, to summarize this wonderful discussion, the first key takeaway is on South Asia's fragmented identity. While South Asia continues to face challenges as a fractured regional identity, with SAARC failing to achieve meaningful integration, there remain intrinsic values that governments, civil society organizations, and people centric approaches can leverage for fostering cooperation. Second is the need for a more holistic perspective. India must focus on engaging with states as a whole rather than limiting its approach to the regimes in power. And I think this is an important lesson drawn from the recent debacle in Bangladesh, and both the experts alluded to it. Third is about developing institutional frameworks. India should prioritize building sustainable institutional mechanisms to engage its neighbors. Although New Delhi lacks the financial resources that China wields, it can still leverage innovative approaches such as nimble minilateral groupings or triangular cooperation frameworks with larger economies like Japan or South Korea. Now, these strategies can create mutually beneficial outcomes while counterbalancing China's economic statecraft. And finally, although the Russia-Ukraine war has reshaped global strategic calculations, the deepening Russia-China partnership is unlikely to pose significant challenges in the Indian Ocean region specifically, provided it does not interfere with the principle of freedom of navigation, which doesn't seem likely as of now. So, dear viewer, love thy neighbor is the final verdict. But today's print worldview with Swasti was all about what to do when the neighbors love your arch rival more. That was all for today. Stay tuned.